Welcome to another video of Geospinach. Today we're going to talk about topography, terrain, and how various units such as infantry and armor units act in different terrain types. Eventually we're going to make a video specifically on how to conduct offensive and defensive operations in each of those specific terrain types, but for now let's start with a basic introduction into the concept of terrain and topography. Firstly, we're going to start with plains. Plains will imply open spaces, like a bit of farmland, few houses, and that's all. The two major terrain types that the majority of people will be familiar will be the Great European Plains, which are areas with starting from northern France and reaching up to Russia, and in those areas here we're going to analyze the benefits that each units have, and the same applies for the United States with the Great Plains that slash between them. Now, starting with basic infantry, for example, an infantry in open terrain is quite terrible, and the main reason that is the case is because infantry in open terrains, when it's conducting a military operation, it's attacking a mass assault, is very exposed to any potential attacks. So quite bad. Now for defense, infantry is even much worse. So it's really hard for any infantry-based unit to conduct any defensive operations in open terrains without pre-existing entrenchment positions, dug-ins, and so forth. So without them, an infantry-based units in plains is massively exposed to enemy fire, artillery fire, and as a result, it's quite catastrophic and it's unable to conduct any serious defensive operations in terrain without taking massive casualties. At the same time, though, it is able to conduct and manage a breakthrough. So if it does manage to achieve a breakthrough, quietly, hardly so, it can be able to exploit that breakthrough because the terrain doesn't give any obstacles or so. In regards to organization, it's really easy to maintain organization of command within plains, and it's really easy to communicate with your units, and thus organization remains extremely high in plain terrains. And the same applies for firepower. The reason that is the case for firepower is mainly because if you can see the enemy, you can shoot at the enemy, and not only with small arms, but also with heavy artillery, anti-tanks, and so forth. So firepower is very significant when it comes to plain terrain. And now, in regards to defense against air power, infantry in general is very exposed to air power, but not so much because it can still disguise itself and hide, and as a result not suffer so much significant damage, but it's still generally very exposed. And in regards to supply, then generally supply is really good in plains. For infantry, it's really easy to move in trucks and supply units station in open terrains. Now, in regarding armor, so tank brigades, military brigades, and so forth. In regards to armor, it's really easy to conduct attack operations, and most importantly, armor really shines in plains when it comes to breakthrough. The ability for tanks to break in, because vast open spaces, it means they can fire to a target 2, 3, 4 kilometers away, so firepower can be massively high. Breakthrough and exploitation phase, as we analyzed in the other video, is very successful, as they can be able to push through really fast with no major obstacles, and even if you go off-road, you can still maintain a generally high speed. Now, in regards to defense, the reason they are better than the general infantry is because they can utilize their mobility to counter any possible attack. Now, the only obstacle that tanks face in regards to plain terrain is the exposure to air power. Because there is no concealment, they are very volatile to any type of an air attack. In everything else, plains are the key and the best scenario for any offensive operation when it comes to armor. Now, let's move on to urban warfare. Now, in regards to urban warfare, infantry in general, it's mediocre when it comes to attack. It will suffer quite a lot of casualties, so we're going to argue that it's quite neutral. But infantry, and that's the most important thing when it comes to urban area, is massive increase in defense, because every building, especially when it is a big city, each building by itself is in defensive position. As a result, a unit can conceal itself really well and be able to do a lot of damage to the enemy without suffering a lot of damage itself. Now, even if infantry is able to attack in open terrain, it's really unable to conduct any form of a breakthrough when it comes to a city warfare. So even if some blocks are lost and infantry can move in, the speed they can move in within a city is generally very slow because of the various roads and the unpredictability where the enemy might be hiding, and as a result, the defenders may suffer quite severe casualties. As a result, even if you are able to attack, it's only piecemeal and very small. Also, it's very easy to maintain very high organization within a city, because if you already control an area, it's really easy to go from one place to another due to the roads. Firepower, it's generally bad because it's really hard to see the enemy, but if you are the defendant and you have a clear side of view, that's effective, but outside of that, it's quite hard to hit an enemy you cannot see that also can conceal itself. Urban areas are also very effective when it comes to protecting against air power. If you are within a building, the chance that you will be destroyed by air power is almost zero. You can bomb the city to ruins and the infantry can still survive within it. Now, there is two types of urban areas, and that will be village and a city, and they differ quite massively when it comes to defense. In those cases, air power is not as effective, neither is defense, and breakthrough is possible. Outside of that, though, generally urban areas are the ultimate defensive tools one can use. And that is why when it comes to armor, urban areas are just plainly terrible. They're unable to conduct any offensive capabilities because whenever they manage to break through a city, they are volatile to get attacked from every single direction. As a result, not only they are unable to conduct any attack operations, they are unable to conduct any breakthrough, because even if they manage to push through, they can get attacked by the rear. In regards to defense, good concealment within the city can provide quite good defense for armor units within the city, but again, infantry is key when it comes to urban defense. Now, maintaining a high organization of an armored division within a unit is generally harder than an infantry, because it's much harder to move in your bigger units within the city due to road junctions, constant artillery firepower, and so forth. And because terrain, the various buildings gradually collapse, it's much harder to maintain such organization. Firepower, so the ability of those tanks to fire at targets, are very bad to say the least. Like, if you don't have a direct point of view where you fire at the enemy and be able to hit it, firepower is practically useless when it comes to a city. So even if you have the best tank in the world, if you don't see it in the street just in front of you, it doesn't give you anything. Now, supply, yes, you can maintain quite a high supply. Now, air power, though, and that's quite a big issue that they have when it comes to armor, that yes, they are generally concealed when it comes to city warfare, but you can't really just put a tank into a building that easily, so they are not truly concealed. So they are quite volatile when it comes to air power. So if you have a power that, like the United States, that has absolute air dominance and it's attacking a city, then they can probably destroy quite a lot of tanks even within the city with precision weapons. But outside of that, the general concept with urban warfare is that they are the key for defense, especially for infantry units. They are really hard to conquer. The main means you can conquer them is with encirclement and siege warfare, or general demoralization and routing of the enemy prior, so the moment you enter the city they just fled, or you just overrun them with numbers. So plainly assaults, with which it will result to massive casualties. Now we can move on to hills. Now what would imply to hills? You can have extreme examples of very hilly terrain, or very more basic examples of slight hilly terrain. What I'm referring here is mainly the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is very hilly, and when it comes to Mediterranean specifically, and when it comes to infantry specifically in hills, it doesn't differ that much from plains. The main difference is the fact that they can conduct attack operations quite better because of the concealment that hills provide. Defense now can be achieved in hilly area, but it's quite hard to if you don't have any entrenchments. But if you are able to establish some sort of entrenchments within a hilly area, then a hilly area can become a very strong defensive position. And again, it really varies to how much of a terrain of a hilly area you are defending. Now, in regards to breakthrough, again the same scenario. Even if you are able to break in as infantry, it's quite hard to exploit it, because it's harder to maintain further organization and not getting outflanked, because it's much harder to see the enemy and get good reconnaissance of what is truly happening. Now, organization can easily be maintained in a hilly terrain. Firepower is quite effective because you have a clear point of attack both for your artillery and your small power. But you are quite volatile when it comes to air power, because it doesn't truly cover you. Now, of course, as you know, as normal human beings, there's no one absolute terrain. You can have hilly mountains with a bit of urban area and a bit of trees. Then the thing becomes a bit more complex, but once you understand the main concepts, everything comes in together. Now, specifically armor in urban hilly area, the main difference is the fact that they can provide quite strong defense that many people tend to ignore, in contrast to infantry, mainly because a tank can conceal itself behind hills and can use the hill as an entrenchment itself to fire upon the enemy, if the circumstances allow. So if the technological circumstances of how much the turret can go up and down can allow the tanker. If you have quite a good tanker, you can easily outmaneuver your enemy within the hilly terrain and consume quite a strong casualties. Achieving breakthrough though in hilly terrain is generally hard, but it's doable. The same for attack. Maintaining an organization, you have similar issues with urban warfare, but nothing specific. Firepower, you don't have that much of a clear view when it comes to a tank, but you can have it. But the issue is you are still quite volatile when it comes to air power. Generally, supplies, you can maintain good supplies, maybe not absolutely good supplies, but in general you can maintain good supplies in hilly terrain. Now, let's go into deserts. Now, in desert warfare, things start to get a bit rough, because you have to measure the extent of how much desert you imply. If we are referring to North Africa desert, and that's where I'm referring to, not to the Sahara, the deep Sahara, then in those cases, generally attacking, defending, and breakthrough as an infantry, it's a no-go. It's a really bad choice, mainly because of the hardness of the condition, of the openness of the terrain, of the various issues you will have on maintaining the quality of your equipment in that terrain, and how much you are exposed to enemy fire because of how open the terrain can be. It's also quite hard to maintain organization and high morale because of the harshness of the terrain, but you can achieve quite strong firepower within a desert because of the openness of the field. So it's really similar to urban warfare, plain warfare. So when it comes to plains, the only difference is that the terrain is quite harsh when it comes to humans and equipment. And again, in firepower you are very volatile, and in supplies it's quite harder to reach you because of equipment failure. And moving on into armor, breakthrough in general, it's really easy to achieve, but under some conditions. So it's as good as they are in planes, assuming that you have the right equipment, the quality of the equipment that can survive the conditions of a desert without breaking down. In regards to defense, the same as with planes, you can easily conduct counterattacks because of an open field of fire, and that's why firepower and defense is quite strong when it comes to desert warfare and armor units. Organization is a bit harder to maintain. You can face maintenance problems, and most importantly, maintaining communication if there are desert storms and so forth. Supply is a general big issue when it comes to terrain such as desert, mainly because you will receive much bigger logistical issues because, as we said, lack and destruction of your equipment and so forth. Moving on to forest areas, which there is no one absolute foresty area, but what we refer is a range of how much trees there are in and their density. Now, infantry in forest areas, like urban areas, are quite strong when it comes to their defense. They're really strong because you can easily conceal yourself. Again, it's quite hard to conduct offensive operations on infantry, but it's quite doable because you can conceal and surprise the enemy while you're assaulting. You may not have a direct clear view, but the terrain, while it can be able to conceal you, in contrast with an urban area, it doesn't actually provide you with direct protection. Actually, as we've seen in World War I, tree splinters can be quite deadly. So if, as an artillery regiment, you know an infantry regiment is hiding in a forest, bombarding that forest might result for that infantry regiment to receive quite heavy casualties if they are not entrenched, so if they haven't dug down. Now, maintaining organization is a bit harder, but it's doable for an infantry division. Firepower, we just said. Now, it's especially good when it comes to defense against air power. The natural concealment that forest provides, or foresty areas that provide, makes any type of air power, firepower capabilities quite hard to conduct, especially against infantry. Now, supply can be quite tedious, but it is up to a level that can be maintained, up to a degree that can be maintained. Now, in regards to armor and forests, while they can conduct some sort of attack operations, as we have seen very extensively in World War II, it's really hard to do so, but it has been done, like the Battle of the Ardennes, for example. And if you take the enemy by surprise, you can break through, but if the enemy offers you even the minimal amount of resistance, as we have seen in the Battle of the Ardennes, actually achieving breakthrough without absolute surprise, it's relatively impossible, or at least very hard to achieve. So generally tanks don't do really well in forest areas. What they do well in forest areas is when it comes to defense and concealment. So you can hide an armored division or an armored regiment, for example, within a forest area, and thus gain the advantage of defense and protection against air power. And when you want, you can strike out and utilize surprise and shock to hit the enemy and take advantage of that. Now let's look at a map of how to analyze terrains such as forest and general terrains. Here we have the Battle of the Ardennes, where here what I want you to see is the topography level, the degree at which how much green it shows. This is the indication of how foresty an area is and how hard it is to maintain the attack within that operation. Here you see the general German offensive in the Ardennes failed due to the main issues we argued prior, as well as the fact that it's quite hard to maintain really good supplies in foresty areas, but it's doable. The problem with the Ardennes was because there's also quite a lot of mountains as well as urban areas, making the whole operation quite complex. Now, moving on to jungle. Well, jungle is quite self-intuitive. It's really hard to conduct any meaningful offensive operations, especially breakthrough. I see you Americans there in Vietnam. And as the Viet Cong has proven to us very effectively, the same as with the Japanese, it's a perfect terrain when it comes to defense because of much better concealment than forest. Practically, they are the equivalent of the forest as is the desert to the plains. So they are like forest but much harder terrain. So it's much harder to maintain supplies, especially much harder to maintain supplies, as well as organization of your units, and the terrain is quite harsh on equipment as well. When it comes to armor and jungle warfare, well, practically nothing works. Like, I wouldn't even argue to use jungle for concealment due to the massive supplies issues you're going to face as a commander in general. So armor, it's just out of the question when it comes to jungle warfare. Again, as we have seen very extensively from the Vietnam War as well as World War II. And now let's go into mountainous areas. When it comes to mountainous areas, again, for infantry, the key is defense. It's really hard to penetrate a mountainous areas, practically impossible to conduct meaningful offensive attacks. The only way you can achieve that is with very extensive firepower, so artillery firepower. The clear point of view you have of the enemy, it's not clear at all. So it's really hard to pinpoint the exact position of the enemy. The enemy, it's very easily concealed against you. So conducting offensive operations in mountain terrains is a no-go. Now, conducting defensive operations is really easy to do, and you can do it with very lightly armed units with even basic anti-tank or just heavy explosives, and they can maintain quite a strong defense. You will face generally hard problems with organization as well as supply, but that's mainly it. Now, lastly, one small point I wanted to mention is river crossings. When it comes to river crossings that people sometimes tend to forget, if you don't really have specialized equipment to cross rivers, which the majority of divisions do not possess those equipment, and even if you possess them, you must be able to hold both sides of the river to be able to use those terrains, those equipment. The only way you can actually penetrate the river is that if you control an actual bridge, or if you surprise the enemy, manage to cross on the other side using some sort of boats, and then use your specialized equipment like bridges and so forth to move your army in. But even if you do that, to maintain any sort of continuous offensive, so maintaining supplies, you will have to eventually capture a bridge. Now you can also have much smaller rivers, which in that case they wouldn't really affect tank warfare that much, but they will affect infantry when it's attacking. But it will still make an armor's division job quite harder. So when it comes to warfare, rivers must always be taken into account. Thank you for watching. This video has been mainly to generalize of the various terrains for people that want to understand how terrain really works in warfare, and eventually we'll make videos specifically for each terrain and how it can be utilized and maybe make it in smaller formats. Thank you again for watching. If you have any questions, if you have any more ideas, well, I do have quite a lot of them myself, but if you want questions to be answered in regards to the subjects of warfare, military science, and geopolitics, I'm glad to hear them. Thanks again, and good night.